Hello, I'm Neo Lodzidis. I'm a professor in international conflict analysis at the University of Kent. My presentation today is for the conference on Sudan, Federalist Sudan, organized in October 2021. I'll be talking today about decentralized federation and institution building in Sudan, prospects and precedents from other deeply divided societies and constitutional debates elsewhere. By definition, all federations are decentralized. The main argument there is that the more power you have for provincial governments or federal units, the less agreement you have at the center. Beyond this starting point, I would like to make three important issues, raise important issues for Sudan that I think is relevant for your discussions at the conference today. The first relates to how much we decentralize and what types of decentralized federations do we have? What can we learn from elsewhere? The second is what happens for the government at the center, where there should be power sharing or not, and what kind of power sharing makes more sense for deeply divided societies such as Sudan. And the third point is how do we come about to make this change? There's been discussions in Sudan about having a referendum. And the prospect of having people ratifying any constitutional amendment is often more complex than it appears. So again, what can we learn from elsewhere for the relevant discussions in Sudan? Let me start with the first question on decentralization. So international precedent, the the literature on the topic does not give us a definite answer as to how much decentralization helps deeply divided societies. Societies that opt for federalism for very different reasons, very different conditions that they face. So there's not one magic formula that one could take and adopt in Sudan. That would depend largely on the local circumstances. What is very important here is to adopt the principle of subsidiarity, which is something the European Union has came about, having technocrats deciding rather than political ideology. With the principle of subsidiarity, one could rely primarily on expertise by international local experts as to how the economy will be run, how different parts of the country will communicate with each other. The second important issue is to distinguish between federations and confederations. So the more you decentralize, that doesn't mean that a country will fall apart or will face a prospect of secession. It's a completely different question in the sense that it requires other countries coming in and recognize a unit. That's very complicated, very difficult in the current international system. But whether a unit within a federation could secede or not, it's a matter of a separate agreement, is whether this is written in the constitution, whether there's a provision for it. The degree to which a unit run its own affairs is something that is decided internally, and often what many countries would do is offer this autonomy, this capacity to the units to run their own affairs. But if demands emerge for secession, if demands emerge in a violent way, then they can withdraw some of those concessions to the authorities, to the provincial units. It happened recently in Spain, it happened in Iraq. It's a way of balancing up the demands of units, ensuring that the stability and security of the country is being maintained or negotiated, at least in a constitutional manner. The third thing very important about the third issue that I would raise that is very important in terms of constitutional amendments is a decentralized federation doesn't mean that whatever laws there is for the central government becomes a gain only for the provincial government. Decentralization through the principle of subsidiarity can happen at different levels. It can happen also at the municipal level, and that's probably the most important level that one should consider for constitutional amendments in Sudan. And this is important because once you decentralize, if the provincial authorities decide that they don't want to have municipal decentralization, that's not a very good idea. Often in those municipalities, you might have other ethnic groups, and those ethnic groups might not belong to the majority within the titular state, within that provincial unit. So they will feel that they're losing something as part of federalization. While if you have this cascading form of federalism, where the provincial unit gains some authorities, but then those are transferred to the municipalities, that's a much better way of accommodating diversity, not only at the provincial level, but also at the very local level, where the majorities and the minorities might not necessarily correlate with provincial, the group that has the majority in the provincial level. So a cascading form of federalism, decentralized form of federalism, can take different forms, and it can trigger inclusivity at the local level as well. The final point I would like to make about federalism is that is probably the most important one, is that in many federations we have concurrent powers. So a decentralized system does not necessarily mean that we lose something as an authority from the central government that goes to the provincial government. That's the end of the story. Often in societies that are either small or they don't have many resources, financial resources in the case of Sudan, there is a need for shared decision making and shared burden responsibility between the federal government and the provincial governments. And I give several examples of that on the paper that is attached to this presentation and share with you. You want to build a road, and that can be a role that the provincial government can take over. But how about if this road passes through several parts of the country? Then the federal government has to be involved as well in the discussion, or different provincial governments coming together to make this decision. Imagine a situation where there is a need for a major new investment that again involves the input of several provincial governments, for instance, the transfer of oil and gas through pipelines. Again, these will require joint decision making. Even on issues that traditionally are seen as exclusive responsibility of the federal government, such as foreign policy. We have precedents from around the world where countries have decentralized and given some parts of that to the provincial governments. For instance, the ability for the Kurds in Iraq to have their own cultural centers in other countries that they operate in a way of embassies, but they're not called embassies, they're not recognized as such, because as I mentioned before, the recognition of a state is a much more complicated, separate dilemma, if you wish, in this equation. And this is acceptable. It happened to a lot of countries. There's several examples of this. Again, another example is migration, often again seen as something that is happening only at the government level, at the central government level. In some countries, such as Canada, quotas exist for provincial governments to take some responsibility on this issue. And finally, probably the most important one when it comes to concurrent powers is the judiciary. Many of the decisions will be taken at the court decisions will be taken at the provincial level, but it will be always a Supreme Court that has to make decisions that affect the entire country. And citizens will know that today I'm being judged at the provincial court that might not necessarily be favorable because of my ethnicity, because of my gender, because of my position in the society, class, gender, and other. However, I have the opportunity to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, who often in federal systems has mixed membership, sometimes even experts from elsewhere coming as arbiters, could resolve those deadlocks and make the final decisions, the binding decisions at the very end. So again, this is an example of concurrent powers where you make the first decision at the local level, but then it comes up to a final decision at the federal level if individuals feel that they have a better chance there to address lack of due process. The second topic that I would like to talk today is about power sharing at the center. Institutions matter a great deal for the stability of the country. And here there are three models that relate to the question of decentralization in Sudan, three models when it comes to decentralizing. The first is the kind of the Scottish model that we have in the UK, where a unit within the United Kingdom, Scotland, can run its own affairs, but it has very little input on the decisions that are being made within the UK in general. For instance, as you know very well, Scotland voted to stay in the European Union, but this did not prevent the UK, the rest of the UK, from leaving the European Union. They're not veto players, but they have a high degree of independence from the rest of the UK. High degree of decentralization exists within the United Kingdom political system, but with no veto powers for the rest of the UK. In fact, we're not a federation. We're a quasi-federation according to some definitions. We don't have an English parliament, yet we have a Scottish parliament. So you may have Sudan, and then you may have those other parts of the country that are being decentralized with very little involvement in what's happening in decisions in Khartoum. They send their parliamentarians, and the funny thing there with Scotland is that they make decisions for England. They cannot veto decisions for the UK, but they make decisions for England, and they vote for decisions for England, but those decisions do not have an effect on Scotland itself because of the decentralized system. So a little bit complicated here, not very clean in my view in terms of a decision, but this is an option. If Khartoum, the central government, doesn't want to have too much input from the provincial governments, but wants to give them their own autonomous status, that's one way to go around. The second model is more like Belgium, where you have, let's say, two units, and these two units have to make decisions together, and maybe three units, because in Belgium you have also Brussels. And the idea there is that you can have some kind of bicommunality where two or three communities veto each other's decision. They make the decisions today. They're more like a partnership kind of, the classic consociational arrangement. Third model is one that has more the Nigerian type of approach, or the Kenyan approach, have multiple federal units. The Canadian approach is also a very good example of that. You have multiple units, some have ethnic differentiation than others, and those multiple units cannot veto each other because you have sometimes 36, sometimes 12, so a large number of those. But this is a system that is inclusive because by virtue of having a large number of provinces, those provinces will have to make alliances. They shouldn't be excluded. They all have a say in the central administration. But the danger there is that you may have two or three provinces that feel that they are in perpetuity excluded from the political system, and that's not necessarily a good thing to have in the decision-making process. In addition to these dilemmas, you have the dilemma whether you have a presidential system or a parliamentary system. And here the literature is a little bit more developed, with the majority of the scholars arguing that presidential systems do not fit these kind of consociational arrangements. The idea there is that the presidential systems are too polarizing, where you have two candidates fighting against each other. It's better to have a parliamentary system where parties get elected and then they form coalitions. And in these coalitions, as you have seen recently with Germany's elections, you can have various combinations, sometimes 5 or 6. And the idea there is that if you have these 5 or 6 possibilities, one will emerge, because whoever is negotiating fears that another coalition might emerge with them being excluded. Therefore, they moderate their positions and they enter coalitions voluntarily. But again, the problem there is that certain groups, certain political parties might get excluded. So how do we avoid that? And in the memo that I share with you, I defend, describe, and advocate the Northern Irish approach to power sharing, where all political parties, according to their electoral strength, are included automatically to the political system. It can be used as a transition, but it can be used in the long term as a method of bringing all political actors within Sudan's new constitutional setting. It's a way of not excluding also groups that are associated with the military, with spoilers, and those groups that can bring the agreement and down. So this Dohon style of inclusive power sharing can be both negotiable in a future constitutional setting and the negotiations among political parties, but it's also more enduring in the sense that if everybody is included in, they all have a stake for the stability and good performance, future performance of the political system. I can go more into details in our discussion with that, and I can also demonstrate how it works in practice. The third point I would like to make is we have a number, and you have a number of great ideas of how to reform your country. The question is, how do you ratify it, and to what extent you create inclusive political institutions and inclusive ratification institutions where the public gets involved in voting for some of these amendments. And the elephant in the room here is whether you're going to have a referendum or not. There is a long history of opposition among political science to referendums. They're often too polarizing. There's a fear that majorities will get their own say and exclude the minorities. We have the experience of Brexit here in the United Kingdom, where people voting for a referendum for the first time in the UK having to make a major decision after many decades has been, in the view of the Remainers, a catastrophic decision. So the question here is to what extent a referendum could be suitable for the case of Sudan, were there any alternatives? If the constitutional founders of the constitution decide, of the new constitution decide to go for the referendum, what will be the most relevant and most applicable setting, and what we can learn from elsewhere. So my understanding for the discussions in Sudan is that there will be a multiple number of constitutional amendments that will go into a referendum, and those will be voted independently to each other in a referendum. So the public might reject A, but they might accept B, they might reject C, but they might accept D. This design reminds me very much of the Guatemala referendum of 1999, where a similar set of decisions were made. There were 47 constitutional amendments involving indigenous rights in the indigenous groups, and those were grouped into 4, if I remember correctly, and voted independently to each other. So there are multiple issues with that. The problem is that if there is a coherent majority only in one direction, there is a danger that the majority will get everything. It will be a winner-take-all type of setting. Normally, in a constitutional amendment, we look at those issues as trade-offs, where there's a package and where the minority make a concession on one issue, and in response, the majority reciprocates with concession on another. So these trade-offs might not be possible in a referendum. So that's number one, if you wish, reservation. The second reservation is with regards to how much time people will have in order to vote for those decisions. If you give only a month, for instance, it might not be enough sufficient way of bringing people to the polls. And in fact, in Guatemala, what happened is that only a small proportion, around 14%, if I'm not mistaken, voted in the 1999 referendum, because they felt that this was not, there was enough time, there was enough information to digest this very complex amendments. The third issue is what happens if the referendum fails and the politicians, the elites, need to proceed. It happened in several countries. Politicians decided not to follow the referendum, to make it non-binding. So that might be an option as well. Referendums can be binding, they can be non-binding, and at the end of the day, giving that flexibility to decision makers could be very useful, especially if they feel that there is a need, an absolute need to proceed and make those changes. Then it makes more sense to allow for non-binding referendums in the process. There are multiple other dilemmas involving referendums as to their timing, as to the composition of the electorate, as to who decides the precise questions. Are fundamental when it comes to countries introducing their first referendums ever on constitutional amendments. Thank you very much, and looking forward to answer your questions.